Through the centuries, fashions have changed due to historical trends, influential personalities, and social change. People have adorned their bodies with the pelts of animals they had slain for food, with precious fibers discovered throughout the world, and a variety of metal armors used during time of war. Through it all, the need for people to stay in touch with the latest fashions has remained constant. Hi, I'm Louisa Fury. I'm here to talk about the history of clothing, fads, fashions, and classics. Let's start with the basics. We wear clothing, for instance, to protect our bodies by providing warmth and comfort. Clothing also helps us to improve our appearance by making ourselves more attractive. In addition, our clothing tells others about us by making a statement about who we are. Early man may have worn the skin of a reindeer for warmth, but may also have wanted to show neighbors that he was a great hunter. By the end of the Stone Age, about 25,000 years ago, the needle was invented, which enabled people to sew these animal skins together. They had also learned to make yarn from the fur of some animals and to weave yarn into cloth. These few advances took place over thousands of years. Most of the changes in the ways clothes were made have come only during the last few hundred years. Until about 200 years ago, people had no machines for making clothes. All garments were made in-home by hand. Today, people in most parts of the world can buy ready-to-wear garments made in large clothing factories. Let's step back in time and look at how history has affected what people have worn. Over the centuries, people have restructured their body shape with clothing. They have emphasized certain body parts and have tried to de-emphasize others. The natural body, as we know it, does not exist. In days gone by, bustles and side panels were used to emphasize the hips and derrieres. Shoulder pads helped to broaden the upper body. Hoops and crinolines made the waist look smaller. Some of these garments were so cumbersome and heavy that mobility was restricted. However, as the 1920s approached and women won the right to vote, their clothing changed considerably. The chemise and flapper look prevailed. A boyish look was to be achieved at the expense of flattening the chest. Short hair, bare arms and legs signified women's newfound freedom. Also, they chose to wear straight, unfitted dresses hung to the knee. Mass production of garments gave women more fashion options at a reasonable price. The idea of employing a dressmaker or making their own garments was no longer a necessity for having new clothes. The 1930s brought about more changes as the world was hurting. The stock market crash in 1929 later culminated in the Great Depression. At this time, the United States was a more rural area with small towns abundant. People wore what they had and patched and reworked them to prolong wear. Clothing became more body conscious in the 30s, flattering the contours of the body. The double-breasted suit appeared in the men's market to accent large shoulders and a trim waist. Day and evening wear for women was very contrasting. Special occasion and lingerie or hostess-type clothing became very special. Times were hard and people used clothing to make themselves feel better. Mass production of clothing and the advent of man-made fibers enabled every status of society to dress stylishly. The rise of the middle class and the influence of Hollywood prevailed. The 1940s and World War II brought about rapid change with a shortage of fabric for clothing. Utility clothing in England became the norm, and long-wearing, durable garments were encouraged. Hemlines went up, but tailored styles and slacks were made popular by women working in factories. But the high cost of clothing was experienced by most everyone. The Depression mentality was instilled, and having one good suit was a staple for most people. In 1947, the new look, or Dior look, became popular to provide a more feminine look. The padded shoulder military look of the 40s gave way to the fullness of clothing. Nylon garments, including stockings and lingerie, became available in large quantities for the first time. After decades of war and rationing, the 50s were a time of wealth and abundance. The baby boom began, and suburbs were springing up everywhere. Summer suits were a prerequisite for men, and seersucker fabric was the staple. The lapels were narrow, and the ties were shiny. Teenage girls in the 50s adopted the full, flared crinoline look. Ponytails, saddle shoes, and a poodle skirt that swayed as she walked were basic wardrobe necessities for the 50s teenage girl. Fashion was changing with the introduction of rock and roll. Young people were making their own decisions about how they looked and were defying their parents in just about everything, especially their clothing choices. A group of nonconforming people called beatniks met in coffee houses to read poetry and speak out against the establishment, meaning anyone in authority. James Dean and Marlon Brando introduced jeans and leather to everyday fashions. Jeans were worn to signify the working class. What was viewed as a far-out fashion in the 50s was adopted as a hot fad in the 60s. The 60s brought about the biggest change in clothing since the 1920s. It correlated the women's movement, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War. The decade began with the look of Jackie Kennedy and ended with the look of just about anything an individual wanted. The youthquake was the name historians gave to this swelling generation of baby boomers. By the year 1965, half of the population of the United States was 25. They wanted to be heard. They were loud in their outrage at what was happening around them. Thus, they wore bold clothing such as hot pants, miniskirts, maxi coats, bell-bottoms, and T-shirts. Polyester, nylon, and vinyl were easy man-made fibers that were fun and non-conforming. The 60s were one big costume party highlighted by Chubby Checker, the Beatles, and Motown. Anyone who was not faint in heart or was not afraid to shock people could participate. These radical movements of the 60s loosened the structure of the dress code in the corporate world. The young people did not accept the formal dress of the past generations and introduced their casualness to the working world. The classic two-piece suits for men remained popular. For casual wear, blazers were combined with bold plaids and stripes, while pantsuits became an acceptable form of attire for women in the workforce. The 70s brought the focus on working women. The workforce was changing and women were moving to the front lines. This need to project credibility was affirmed by John Malloy's books, Dress for Success and Dress for Success for Women. He informed women that the only road to success was to dress as much like men as they could if they were to be inducted into the hallowed offices of corporate America. By wearing a tie, she was one of the boys. Also during the 70s, men of all ages joined in the change to colorful clothing. They began wearing checkered and striped shirts with their business suits, and they wore wide ties in fancy colors and prints. Polyester was king, and leisure suits were a must-have item. Platform shoes were very popular for the 70s men. Also, they began to sport beards and mustaches and grew their hair longer than in the 60s. Fashion changed rapidly in this decade. Many new fabrics were used in the 70s. Men and women were often found wearing similar styles. The 80s were a time of opulence, greed, and consumption. TV shows such as Dallas and Dynasty depicted people with power dressed in designer goods and jewelry. All of society yearned to be one of the haves, or at least look like one. The availability of clothing ranged from discount stores to the upper-scale shops. In between were off-price shopping marts and manufacturers' outlets. Women began adorning themselves again, emphasizing color and femininity. Hemline stayed consistently below the knee. The power look of the 70s began to be taken seriously with added glitz and new silhouettes. Loose-fitting jackets and coats became available. Fashion for men in the 80s included business suits, sportswear, and casual attire with an accent on color. They experienced a swing back to the natural fabrics. Comfortable cotton was popular again. In the 90s, we see a return to the basics, often a more conservative classic look. Hillary Rodham Clinton set the fashion trends for women with brightly colored suits. Women are choosing feminine clothing to wear to the workplace, and men are finding it more desirable to express themselves through what they wear. There is a casual look to what the men and women of the 90s are wearing, and comfort is essential for both. Let's explore the language of clothing to better understand the changes in our society as well as ourselves. Clothing is a form of nonverbal communication which was always spoken loudly. Think about the statements people make with their clothing. Your clothing is a neon sign that communicates to others about you. When you look around at what people are wearing, you should be aware that clothes can be classified as fads, fashions, or classics. Can you tell who is wearing which in this picture? A fad is an item that hits the mainstream of fashion very quickly. It is something new that is popular with some groups for only a short time and is often more bizarre than normal fashion. A fad quickly gains popularity, then disappears. Blue jeans and sneakers were thought to be a fad. They were so popular with teenagers that now all ages wear jeans. A fashion is what's currently in. It is the style of clothing that is popular at a certain time. A fashion represents what everyone is wearing. A large and diverse group wear it for a period of time. Both fads and fashions have a limited life expectancy. A classic is timeless, meaning that it remains popular for a long period of time and rarely goes out of style. Some examples of classics are jeans, the basic navy blazer, button-down collars on shirts, basic V-necks, round and turtleneck sweaters, leather jackets, loafers, and pearls. How is fashion created? Some fashion is introduced by fashion leaders and include people like Cleopatra, Jackie Kennedy, and Lady Diana. They have a group of admirers and followers who seek to identify with the fashion leader by imitating their style of dress. These people often set themselves apart from most of society and then find people imitating them. Madonna became famous wearing a form of a corset as a stage costume. Many women followed the trend, wearing underwear as outerwear, although in a moderate interpretation. Clothing designers must work to be in tune with the feeling and the spirit of the time. Changes in fashion begins on the streets and by redesigning fashions from the past. Designers are observant and look to people for their inspiration. Label-conscious consumers play it safe by identifying and gaining status from famous designers like Girbaud, Guess, and Ralph Lauren. The designer name or logo reminds us and others that this clothing item must be fashionable. When Christian Dior introduced the new look in 1947, it became so popular that it emerged as the look of the 1950s. The miniskirts, which were marketed in the 1960s, sold. However, they did not sell as well in the early 1990s. This is called a fashion cycle. Colors, styles, fabrics all go through fashion cycles. One year, soft colors may be popular. The next year, brights could be in fashion. Two social tendencies, conformity and individuality, form the basis for fashion choices. You may choose to conform to a particular style in an attempt to look like everyone else. Typically, men like to conform to the rules of fashion for men. They are most comfortable if they look like everyone else. Most women, on the other hand, prefer a more individual look. They want to blend, but are uncomfortable if they look identical to anyone. People who wish to make a statement of individuality will wear a more unique, one-of-a-kind outfit to set themselves apart from others. Everyone else has it is a familiar saying, and our clothing choices are all influenced by peers, company standards, dress codes, and the media. We may think we are unique, but it is usually within a socially acceptable range. Greater conformity is required of men's clothing. Men's fashions tend to change more slowly than women's, mostly because their styles are more deeply rooted in custom. Women have greater freedom to express their individuality through a wider range of choices due to greater variations in fabric, color, and design. Sometimes clothing stereotypes people because we draw conclusions by what we see on the outside. This can be effective in many situations. A prime example of this concept is often used in the court system. An alleged murderer may have been arrested while looking unkempt, but when he appears in court, he is clean-shaven with neat hair and is wearing a suit. This is done to give the visual appearance of the all-American kid from next door, a stereotype. Uniforms are another way to stereotype people. It's an easy way to learn something about a person. Police officers, bus drivers, and mail carriers wear special uniforms to help other people identify what they do. Some types of uniforms show that a person belongs to a certain group, such as Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, or a certain school. Uniforms are generally trouble-free and give people more time to concentrate on their career, sports, and hobbies. Dress codes or uniforms are often implemented to provide sameness and eliminate peer pressure. What we wear makes an important first impression. What first impression might you have about these two people? Research shows that most people form opinions about others from appearances, and clothing reflects what you think is important. People use their clothing as a form of self-expression, making a statement about who we are, how we feel, or even what we think. Maybe you are an extrovert who prefer bold patterns and colors. Perhaps you are a conservative person who enjoys muted, softer colors and styles. When wearing a party dress or a suit, your actions, behavior, and body language may be formal. But if you are wearing cut-off jeans and a t-shirt, your behavior and body language tend to be more relaxed and casual. Feelings and actions are often influenced by how we are dressed. Today, sportswear and activewear are in the mainstream of fashion. They are informal, comfortable, functional, and have easy care instructions. More people today choose to wear styles they like to wear, even if the style of the garment is not in fashion. Clothing will always be a form of expression. Fashions reflect the lifestyles of generations gone by. Clothing will always communicate what is going on in society, as well as how a person is feeling about themselves on that particular day. Through their choices in clothing, people will always be able to express their personalities, their moods, their fantasies, and their intelligence.